This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Joseph Majkut and Caitlin Welsh of CSIS are, at least I'd say, two of the world's leading experts on energy and food prices. Even in wealthy countries, there are many families who can't afford food. Those who earn the least are most likely to not be able to feed their kids, which creates a real impact not only for them, but for society as a whole. When you zoom out to look at this on a global scale, 690 million people go to bed on an empty stomach every night. And when nations go to war or are invaded, it's harder to move aid to those who need it, and the conflict itself can have massive impact on the global supplies of food or of fertilizer or of energy and the markets that spring up around them. Right now, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the news, and with countries in Europe and elsewhere thinking about reducing their own energy intake from Russia, we were lucky to talk with Joseph and Caitlin about what's happening to food and energy prices, why gas is so expensive, for example, and how all of this fits together. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information about how to join us or past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode featuring Molly McHugh. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
The initial spikes that we've seen and the higher prices we've seen today, how much is that due to the sanctions? And how much of that is due to supply chains actually being disrupted? Or is this just speculation at this point?
Well, I think it's important to start with a little bit of background on where energy markets were before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have, coming out of the COVID crisis and reaching some steady state there, energy markets were sort of returning to normal after having this big demand shock. And investment in new oil and gas production was relatively slower coming online. And what that meant was we already had relatively tight global markets. Now, there's a particular case in Europe, which we can get into later, in the natural gas sector, which is causing real challenges there at the moment. But you're talking about oil prices, which is really a global market. So, last fall and even in the early part of this year, we were seeing rising prices as the economic outlook looked better and production was going to catch up, we would assume, eventually with those prices. Then you have the invasion. Now, Russia is a really important energy provider. It exports something like 8 million barrels of oil a day against a global market that's about 100 million barrels a day. So it's a big player. And while we haven't yet seen direct energy sanctions at a global level raised against Russia, what we have seen is a variety of financial sanctions, individual countries like the United States banning imports from Russia, and firms that were either operating in Russia or buying Russian crude deciding to not do that anymore out of solidarity with Ukraine or feeling political pressure or maybe just long-term risk management. All that has created a lot of what I would describe as anxiety in the marketplace about the ability of Russia to continue delivering 8 million barrels a day. The IEA, which is the International Energy Agency based in Paris, they track global energy markets. They predict somewhere between 2 and 3 million barrels a day could eventually come offline out of Russia because of the existing financial sanctions, right? That's not new ones. That's just the stuff that's in place now. We will know sort of this month whether or not we're going to start seeing the effects of that self-sanctioning. And then we'll start to see the pricing environment evolve to what the real impact of the financial sanctions has been.
And while we're nonpartisan here, I do want to just clear something up, Joseph, because you mentioned we had seen higher oil prices and gas prices in the United States prior to the invasion. And we had a lot of Republican politicians using this as a political cudgel against the Biden administration, against Democrats. It is my understanding that these prices are not what the Republicans are arguing, that it's not a lack of leases on federal lands or specific policies that the Democrats have done to cause a reduction in investment in oil and production and gasoline, but it's more just a natural supply chain shock due to COVID, logistics, inflation. Can you kind of parse whether it's the GOP and they're right, it's Biden's fault, or if it's just a natural issue due to us coming out of a pandemic, starting to use more gas and other supply and demand issues?
There's a couple things going on in your question. You always come with multi-layered questions, Justin. That's why your program's so good. The Biden administration came in with a very strong climate agenda, and that was seen as diametrically opposed to what the Trump administration was trying to do, which was unleash American energy on the world or have this sort of energy dominance agenda. Now, like the U.S., unlike a lot of major energy producing countries, has a market-based economy, right? Like we don't exert a lot of political control over the oil and gas sector in the way that like Russia or Saudi Arabia might with state-owned enterprises and stronger market controls. So really, it's a question of like what investors in energy companies are supporting energy companies to do and what energy companies think oil prices are going to be in the future, right? So they're making like investment decisions. And what we saw coming out of the last decade, particularly acute after the COVID shock, was a lot of energy producing companies in the United States were financially underperforming. They were losing money, particularly in the shale industry. And for the better part of a decade, like banks were kind of okay with that. They kept being loaned money. After the COVID shock, banks were not. They wanted the money back. And so now we're in a phase where a lot of energy companies in the United States are being asked to be fairly disciplined in their use of capital. And that means that even as prices are going up, the sort of willingness to go out and drill or produce a bunch more is a little bit abated. Now, many analysts thought that over the course of this year, that would resolve itself. I mean, talking before the invasion, that the U.S. would add up to 1 million barrels per day on its own production, simply in response to rising prices. That's how the market works. You know, there on the margins, there are political complaints that Republicans have made, that the industry has made about Biden administration choices. I'm less convinced that those are as like immediately responsive to the issues that we face right now. They're more long-term issues. So, you know, it's hard to evaluate what the alternative state of the world would be where this administration was like so much more friendly to fossil fuel production and like banks still didn't want their money back, right? That's what really was one of the primary limiting factors. And so when you're talking about losing 2 to 3 million barrels, let's just take that number as like a plausible one over the next few months of against daily production, you know, how much could the U.S. really add, and would that protect consumers at the pump? Probably not. That's a big supply shock.
So, Caitlin, the oil shortage that we're seeing, the rise of the Brent crude oil, how much of that is impacting the food pricing increases that we're currently seeing? And we'll get into all the other aspects of food prices shortly.
I don't think that it's possible to parse out the proportion of the price increase in a number of agricultural commodities that's due to the increase in energy prices. All we can say is that there's a high degree of correlation between energy prices and food prices. And certainly the way that this crisis is affecting energy prices is it's also affecting food prices, as we're seeing around the world.
Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus are major suppliers of fertilizer, both the products used to create fertilizer themselves. I'm wondering how much of that is impacting food prices now, and how much of that should we be concerned about impacting food prices in 6 months to a year when the next crop is coming up?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you mentioned, both Russia and Belarus are top exporters. Russia is a top exporter of nitrogen fertilizer, second leading supplier of potassium, third of phosphorus fertilizer. Belarus is the third largest exporter of potassium fertilizers. So yes, decreased exports in fertilizers from those countries are affecting fertilizer markets. That is affecting plans for agricultural production in the future. It's not necessarily affecting prices of food that's on the market or ready for export. So it's not affecting food that's already out there ready for purchase and consumption, but it is affecting plans for production for future crops.
How bad bad is the global shortage of fertilizer right now?
Huge problem. The globe is very tight fertilizer. It's a confluence of factors, unprecedented demand coupled with a huge fall off in supply availability, only just exacerbated by the war in Ukraine and what's going on with exports coming out of Russia and Ukraine. So we are. What are you
doing about it? How do you ramp up to help meet that demand?
We run those plants 24/7, 365. There are very few incremental tons that we can make. We have pushed out some maintenance activities. We have added some logistics capabilities, some vessels and rail cars, but there's no new tons to make. It's just a matter of trying to get them as quickly as we can into the marketplace.
Looking at U.S. agriculture in particular, we don't rely on exports from Russia and Belarus to meet our fertilizer needs to the extent that other countries do. Brazil, for example, is the world's largest importer of fertilizers for its own agricultural production. Majority of that comes from Russia and Belarus. What we're seeing is simply a shifting in markets, shifting in sourcing. So Brazil now looking to Canada as its main source for potassium fertilizers. In other examples around the world, there is potential to make up for the decrease in supply from Russia and Belarus right now, not to the extent that we would like. The ability that we have to make up for that, for the lost supply, comes from potential for countries to tap reserves that they're not already mining, but these are discrete minerals that aren't available in every country.
If the fertilizer, there was a shortage, prices spiked, which continents, nations, areas around the world would likely feel this the most in price concerns?
Every major agricultural producing country is going to feel this. You know, there are a number of raw materials that constitute most fertilizers. So ammonia, nitrogen, nitrates, phosphates, potash, sulfates, there are a number of those. But we're seeing immediate effects on the exports from Russia and Belarus. We're seeing ripple effects on products that are seen as substitutes for those fertilizers. So, I mean, even in the United States, you're seeing greater demand for manure as a fertilizer. And what you might see there is a shift away from using fertilizer at all, simply because the cost of production would be too high. And in that case, you would see further decreased outputs from farmers in those countries.
I wanted to look at oil. Russia's largest exporter, it looks like their biggest market is to China. Are there any other countries that would materially, if they were to ban Russian exports, materially impact that 1 to 2 million barrels a day shortfall? And what pricing impacts would that have?
If you, let's say Europe cut off Russian oil, then you would see a substantial decrease in output simply because the infrastructure that can accept the kind of oil produced in Russia, refine it into useful products is there in Europe, and it would take a long time for Russia to reorient its export supply chain to deliver oil to other places. That being said, we expect to see, and we already are seeing perhaps, some shifting of markets because it is a global market. Trading houses and other entities are able to kind of create blends of oil or do other financial tricks that make it appear that this stuff is moving. So really, if you're going to have a sanctions regime, which I agree we may see, it will have to be pretty broadly implemented. It'll be a big political fight. And I think you could anticipate it to have a pretty large price impact.
And would we need to rely on negotiations with countries like Saudi Arabia to replace that? I know we're trying to increase our production immediately, but how would we deal with specifically the oil shortfall?
I think you need to do two things, maybe three actually. The first is look to where other suppliers can help pick up the slack. Saudi Arabia, the UAE are good examples. You know, it's commonly held that they have a lot of capacity that they could start producing with relatively quickly. Thus far, OPEC Plus, the cartel of oil-producing countries, has not met the current moment with any change to their planned increases in the production schedule. And it's not clear that they're really willing to play ball on that front. So the question of whether or not there's going to be an Iran deal and how much oil that could release into global markets is a big one. Likewise, the administration from the US has reached out to Venezuela to try and see if production there can be brought back online. Number two, you need to start looking at places that might otherwise be looking to buy that oil at a discount. This is, China, India, other South Asian countries. You need to have a diplomatic push to make sure that sanctions that were being levied against Russia were truly impacting it. Because in an environment where, you're not creating a lot of financial pressure, if the price of oil is, let's say, $140 and Russia's still able to sell at $100 a barrel, even though that's a huge discount, they're still reaping a lot of money from a discounted sale. So you need to do something to fight that phenomena as well. The third thing you can do, which is not a conversation that we have particularly easily in the United States, but, I was on the phone yesterday with some Europeans and they're thinking about ways to do this, is find ways to reduce demand relatively quickly.
I wanted to kind of go through those a little bit. One intriguing option would be Iran, but that's going to depend largely on negotiations. The second would be Venezuela. Is it possible, after being sanctioned so hard for so long, that they could relatively quickly ramp up production in a meaningful way?
I don't know about relatively quickly. I think there's been a big brain drain and loss of infrastructure. I don't have a barrel number for you. My sense is that this market, the oil market, markets are good things, right? They figure out problems. If you're thinking about cutting off all Russian supply in 2 months, I think there's big upside risk there. If you're thinking about, significantly reducing over the course of a year or year and a half, then I think markets have a lot of ways to respond.
I wanted to go to some rising food prices with Caitlin. Since the reinvasion of Ukraine, food prices were increasing due to supply chain shortages, inflation, but they've appeared to skyrocket in wheat, in soy, in corn. And we know that Russia and Ukraine are both major producers. How much of the increase of food prices from after the invasion is due to speculation, and how much of it is due to supply chains, particularly in Ukraine, actually being disrupted?
At this point, a lot of this is due to speculation because a lot of these products that these countries export are already on the market. We haven't seen actual decreases, with some important exceptions, in ag commodities on markets yet. What I will say is the biggest impacts of this might come in at least 6 months. And that's because a lot of the projections that we're seeing for reduced exports out of Russia and Ukraine have to do with grains and ag products that have already been harvested and are ready for export. They don't yet calculate the impacts of the war on crops that have been planted and will be ready for harvest this coming summer, or on crops that haven't been planted yet that would be planted this coming fall and for harvest the next year. Where we could see the biggest impacts on actual supplies on markets is going to be at least 6 months down the road.
Is there anything that U.S. farmers or Western farmers can do regarding the planting of certain crops? I know that some farmers, or a lot of farmers, try and project price surges and then plant their crops that way due to farm insurance and other subsidies that we have set up and built into our system. But is there a way for us? It seems like producing agricultural products, like sometimes oil products, can take a long time. Is there a way for us to quickly pivot and try and fill these voids?
Yeah, quickly pivot, certainly not. I've seen that proposed as a solution, but when it comes to wheat, for example, wheat is a fertilizer-intensive crop, so you're not going to see farmers expanding production of wheat when the costs of production are soaring. We can't pivot quickly because of costs of production, and also because of amount of land that's arable. We're seeing requests by some senators to take land out of conservation in order to increase the amount of land we're able to plant on. That's been shut down by Secretary Vilsack at this point. But no, unfortunately, there is no easy pivot solution for this.
And I know that China is a large market where we export, soy and other products. And every time that there's a global shortage that skyrockets prices, and this is more applicable to food, I think, because it's more possible maybe, there's a call for protectionism and to ban exports of U.S. food products globally, especially to enemies like the CCP government. Is that something that we could hear in our policy dialogue, not just from, fringe members, but maybe from more establishment voices? And is that a solution, or is that just crazy talk?
That's interesting. I haven't yet myself heard calls for protectionism and banning exports within the United States. They're probably out there. I haven't come across them myself. I think that we know well enough the negative impact on export bans on food security around the world and on ag markets around the world that they only have the effect of driving prices up even further. In the food price crisis of 2007, 2008, when the prices of a number of commodities doubled in a really short period of time, in just over a year, the WTO estimated that 40% of that price increase was due to the imposition of export bans by a number of exporting countries. So we know that export bans can only drive prices higher. So we're seeing calls, I think wisely, by the G7, by the UN and others not to impose those, despite the fact that they can appear attractive to ag producing countries.
What kind of impact might we see on the developing world if the food prices do skyrocket? It would obviously be felt more so there, but what would the real world impact could it look like?
Yeah, the effect is going to be felt worst in countries that rely on imports to meet most of their caloric needs. And there's going to be a differentiation between the middle income countries and then the lower income countries. In middle income countries, they might be able to subsidize the price of food so that the poorest of the poor aren't bearing the brunt of this. In poorer countries, though, they don't have the ability to subsidize those prices, and you will see prices increase, and you will see those with least access to income being affected the worst, not only by the amount of food they're able to consume, but oftentimes what you'll see first is a shift away from highly nutritious food, which is also more expensive, toward staple foods, which can fill your belly but don't provide the nutrition that's needed for active and healthy lives.
While the supply of crude oil has been interrupted from Russia, leading to a jump in its prices, it is the shortage of another oil that is of concern to world economies as well. The shortage of sunflower oil that is used in chips, cookies, ready meals, biscuits, and even mayonnaise is now giving sleepless nights to many countries. Now, the biggest bottler of cooking oil for the UK retailers only has enough sunflower oil left to last a few weeks. Edible Oils, a company that packages oil for 75% of the UK retail market, said the war in Ukraine had disrupted supplies of sunflower oil, forcing it to look at other oils for customers.
Are there any more pressing ramifications from the war in Ukraine and specifically Russia that we should be worried about and concerned about with more imminent price increases?
I think it's as important to look at ripple effects on commodities that aren't necessarily produced by Russia and Ukraine. So we know that these countries constitute much of the global export market for sunflower oil, for example. So what we're seeing around the world, I had mentioned record highs for other types of oil. That has effects on grocery store shelves all over the world. So for example, in the UK, they're shifting a number of products that might have incorporated sunflower oil, like mayonnaise or margarine or bread, might be looking to substitute oils. So they're finding other oils to produce these food items. So they're doing that so they can increase production and meet demand from their consumers. But then you have their food agencies having to adjust their labels to label for allergens, and that's delaying production of these products. And so you have, I think, never before seen ripple effects on commodities and other products whose exports are being decreased. I give a lot of other examples, but I've never before seen one crisis affecting so many types of foods and prices of so many types of foods around the world as we're seeing right now.
So before we get into specific impacts of gas bans, maybe from Germany, can you explain if at all the oil and gas markets are related or if they are independent entities completely?
Related markets in many places, oftentimes natural gas and oil are produced together, but the market constructions internationally are very different. Oil exists on a relatively global market. Prices are relatively even around the globe. But shipping and transit are able to move things around in response to market demand. With gas, that is less the case. The infrastructure that moves gas is oftentimes pipelines, which are pretty specific. Increasingly, over the last few decades, there's trade in liquefied natural gas, which can flow over oceans. The U.S. has become a key exporter, and we can talk about our role in supplying Europe. But LNG prices, the prices for LNG delivered into Europe are much higher, for instance, than the prices that you and I pay for natural gas when we turn on the stove or heat a home here in the United States. And so the characteristics of the two energy markets are quite different.
I saw a poll saying 60% of German citizens a week ago were in favor of banning all energy from Russia. Is that possible? And would they be able to make up that 32% from the US, from Qatar, from those other nations that you mentioned, or are we pumping at maximum capacity and exporting at maximum capacity?
It's very implausible that you would see a full exit of Europe from Russian energy in like a short period of time. But I fully think that we should expect to see one over this decade, right? That's what Europe is planning to do. The EU Commission has released plans to get off oil and gas imports from Russia by, I believe, 2027. It's a tricky balancing act, though. That's for a few reasons. One, let's take the case of gas. Europe's buying 150 billion cubic meters of Russian gas a year. You can't just go and buy that from other places, right? The infrastructure doesn't exist to deliver that much LNG to Europe. There isn't that much LNG or excess LNG floating around in global markets, just ready to be delivered. The supply chains for that have to be built. So last week, or maybe the week before, the US and the EU agreed that they would target like substantially more trade. I think 50 billion cubic meters. So that's like a third of imports, Russian imports, by 2030. But that involves building new infrastructure, new export terminals out of the US, new regasification facilities in Europe. And then the Europeans are trying to figure out, well, how do we deal with all the other use cases for gas, right? It's used in Europe for power generation. It's used to heat homes. It's used in industry. And you got to look at the full package. I think over the decade, what we're seeing now is a European intent to get off the energy reliance on Russia, and that's going to involve buying more gas from the U.S. and out of international markets. It's going to involve faster deployment of renewable and other low-carbon technologies, which was part of the European Energy Plan anyway. And it's going to involve some technological innovation and some challenges on the industrial side to make sure that they continue producing industrial goods. If you just cut gas supplies off, which like Putin was threatening to do last week, if Europe wasn't paying in rubles, like industrial facilities would shut down, right? Fertilizer, energy, like steel, a bunch of stuff would stop being made. And I think the economic implications of that, the humanitarian implications of that could be potentially quite bad.
What type of impact does rising food prices have on the UN, the US, the West's ability to provide humanitarian aid in the form of food to developing nations, to nations at war, and to people that actually really need this stuff to survive?
So what we're seeing is that increase in food prices is going to make countries that are already experiencing food insecurity crises, the countries that are on the brink, we might see a shift toward increased need for humanitarian assistance as these countries are unable to afford the food that their citizens need, and also a decrease in purchasing power by the World Food Program. WFP sources around 50% of its wheat from Ukraine. As global prices of wheat increase, the WFP's dollar isn't going to go as far. And so what you're seeing is they're unable to reach as many people with the funds that they have. So they will need more money. The total of their appeals will increase. So it's just going to have a multiplier effect in the wrong direction for emergency aid organizations.
Do we expect countries like the US, or the US specifically, to increase allocations to these programs? Or do we think that might not be politically tenable in the current divided Senate, the elections approaching, and maybe a GOP-controlled House moving forward?
I wouldn't be surprised if we saw an increase in our funding for World Food Program. Throughout the Trump administration, you saw increases almost every year in the amount of funding we're giving to the World Food Program. That was not due to the Trump administration's position, but rather leadership from Republicans in Congress, who made sure that our donations were sustained, if not, as I mentioned, increased in that time. So I don't think that the House potentially flipping or Senate potentially flipping, I don't think that will threaten the amount of funding that we could see go into the World Food Program.
Do we see in the United States, at least, that this conflict, the supply shortages, the prices skyrocketing, will have a negative impact on the transition to green energy in the United States? Or do we just see this as a temporary issue?
Europe is more immediately affected by these challenges at this moment. And I think there we expect to see an acceleration of the green transition. We've already seen countries making commitments to that end. Here in the US, what we've been saying from our program is that this is an opportunity for us to devise an energy policy that is smart strategically and aware of the risks of climate change. This administration is promulgating a set of rules for the methane emissions that go alongside oil and gas production, which are world leading. They're some of the best regs devised in terms of what they ask companies to do, how cleanly they ask them to operate.
That concludes today's conversation. Again, huge thanks to Joseph and Caitlin, to CSIS, and most of all, to you for being here. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information on how to join us, as well as past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode featuring Molly McHugh. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for being a part of this community. I'm Jeff Browning on behalf of Justin Higgins and John Gunnison, our co-founders. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.